Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Clueless Capitalist, where we discover interesting startups, interview founders, and help you become less clueless with angel investing. My name is Razi.
I'm Osman Ahmed, and welcome to the Clueless Capitalist.
In this episode, we're going to be speaking to Craig about the Ocean Psychological Framework to evaluate business success potential. Craig is the co-founder and general partner at Accelerating Asia, Asia's best accelerator VC. Great to have you back on the show, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Razi. Thanks, Osman. Really great to be here, and hopefully I can add some value today.
No, we're really excited. Well, I am anyway, because when I was talking to you at the demo day at Accelerating Asia a few weeks back, you introduced this framework to the people that attended on that day, and I found it to be amazingly insightful, because this is a typical problem that we as angel investors have when we're looking to invest at early stage. Everyone talks about, let's have a look at the due diligence, let's have a look at the data room. And often with pre-seed or pre-series A startups, there typically isn't a lot in there to actually evaluate. It might be that there's not enough traction, there's not enough data points. And one of the things that I've seen from a number of posts from people in the VC space is around what you evaluate at different stages. So if you're looking at a pre-series A startup, you should definitely bet on the founding team or the founder. And at Series A, you bet on the product. And then on Series B, you bet on the traction. But typically what's missing here is, how do you evaluate the founder or the founding team? What kind of traits are you looking at? So for me, I'd really struggled with that, because typically I always say to people, "Oh, I really like the founder." I can't put my finger on it. I really don't know what's triggered me around a particular founder or the founding team. There are a number of different patterns that I'm recognizing subconsciously, and your framework actually helped put that into context for me. And I thought this would be a great way to get you to talk through it, and hopefully we can share that with our audience.
Yeah, and Osman, I think you really described my journey to Ocean, because as you know, I've been now investing in early stage startups, and by early stage, it's really early, right? Some of them just have a little bit of revenue, and they're fairly new. Some of them have had revenue for less than 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. And so when you're evaluating the business itself, there's not a whole lot of tangibility there. And so to your point, you're looking at the founders, and we always had the same kind of thing. What are you looking for? Oh, we want somebody who's a hustler. You hear all these words, but you can't, there's no test. There was the hustle test, right? You're kind of asking questions, you're trying to give them a hustle score in your own way, right? And over time, I think we all get better at it. But what I was looking for was, how can we find a scientific way to do this, quote unquote, properly, with some science base and some, enough data points that there's at least some reliability there to add to the evaluation criteria. So I think exactly what you went through, I kind of went through. And then I discovered this through my own random self-education of just learning about, human psychology and for my own uses. And we can talk today about how this is useful, I think, even if you're not, specifically investing in startups. But it's been really good for us. We're integrating into the program and really happy to share more about it. And hopefully it's useful, because one of my goals is to help early stage investors become more comfortable to deploy capital into startups. And as you know, at the early stage, it's challenging, because a lot of times the investors are new to investing in startups and the founders are new to running a startup. And so it's much harder to get alignment there. And so anything we can do to grease the wheels and create, more standardization and efficiency in that process, is a benefit to everybody in the ecosystem.
But we're really looking forward to seeing that. If you don't mind, could you share a little bit more about the framework and how it works?
So just a little background to Ocean. It's also called the Big Five personality traits. And it was essentially adopted in the early 1980s at a conference of some of the world's top psychiatrists and psychotherapists. And this is used in psychiatry and psychotherapy. So obviously it's not just about investing in startups, and we'll run through the overall kind of way it works, but certainly how to apply it to investing and into startups as well. So Ocean, and the reason it's called Ocean is the 5 categories that you would get tested on. So you take a test. There's simplified versions that take as little as 10 to 15 minutes, and there's longer versions that take longer. But essentially you get scored on 5 categories. And so it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And in theory, these 5 categories essentially make up every human and every personality of the human. And our personalities tend to lead towards behaviors. And the other thing that's beneficial about Ocean is it tends to be fairly static over time. So there's other tests that can change depending upon your circumstance in life, but Ocean tends to be fairly static. And I've taken the test many, many, many times, and my test scores don't change very much. And in each of these categories, they tend to remain kind of high, medium, or low within a small variance. So that's kind of the background of the test. The goal of Ocean, at least from what I see, is once you understand yourself, you can match your temperament to your environment. And that can be important in many different ways. Today, we're going to talk more about matching the right people with the right job, and specifically, how to match the right sort of personality to a startup founder job. But you can certainly envision the job you're in or the job you want, and are you really the right person for that, right? So I think it can be really educational as a learning journey for yourself, and maybe for other people in your life to understand that. You could imagine that maybe certain types of people match up better with life partners, with people who have different types of personality, and some that aren't. Maybe it can help you with your dating life, where you live, what sort of culture is a good fit for your personality. Anyway, so there's lots of ways that I think it's useful. But of course, today we're going to talk more about the career side. So kind of a question I asked at Demo Day, and I'll just run through this quickly here, but I think it provides a nice contrast into, how the Ocean framework can be applied in different scenarios, right? So the question here is, which 2 traits are ideal for a typical worker in a large organization to score highly in, right? So if you're working for a big company, a bank, insurance company, Google these days, what 2 traits would you want to score highly in that scenario? And this would be, I think, Rousey, like you were talking about, if you're a hiring manager in that organization, and a lot of large corporations do use the Ocean test in recruiting, what would you want to see those applicants, depending upon the job, of course, what would you want to see them score highly in, right? And so these are the options, and our audience can kind of think about what they think the answer is, and I'll come back to it in just a second. So then we want to look at, okay, what are the 2 traits that are ideal for a startup founder to score highly in? And those, there might be some overlap, some things that are important for both working in a large organization and other things that are quite different from working in a large organization. And I'm probably a good example. I used to work in large banks, and I experienced quite a lot of friction. And looking back and knowing my Ocean scores, I think it could have helped me to maybe avoid some of that friction and get out of a large company faster and get into smaller companies, whether or not that's startups. Okay, so again, these are the 5 traits, and then thinking through, which traits might be ideal for a large company and which would be ideal for a startup. So I'll give away the large company one. So in a large company, you certainly want somebody who scores high in conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is things like following through on what you say you're going to follow through on, being reliable, showing up on time for meetings. And obviously, when you have a lot of people, you can't have a lot of people just doing their own thing and not listening to the rules. Large organizations tend to be more rule-based and need people to kind of act in concert. And obviously, if you are never showing up for meetings, that's going to be problematic. And same with, the customers of the business that you're interacting with. So conscientiousness is really important for most jobs, but very important for large organizations. And then the other one for large organizations is agreeableness. Typically, depending upon the job type, you want the employees to score really high on agreeableness. And again, this is kind of the nature of the job. If you have people in the workforce that are just always creating conflict with coworkers, creating conflict with their manager, that's not going to work very well, right? So typically people in larger organizations score more highly on agreeableness. Even if they disagree, they might just go with the flow. They might just go along with what the leadership says. They might be less likely to ask questions and cause friction there, even if they think it's productive. And that was certainly my experience in the bank. I'm not very agreeable, and I would always ask, why are we doing this? And my manager used to always get very frustrated, even though I was convinced I was really trying to help the business and ask good questions. So I was not a good fit for a large organization. Okay, so that's large organization. Now, these are the answers to the startup question. So what two traits should a startup founder score highly in? And conscientiousness is here again. And I think, when we look at early stage founders, we still want to see them be reliable. We still want to see them show up for meetings on time, follow through with promises made, be organized with their financials and documents and their data. And so that's still really important, whether or not you're working in a large organization or a very small organization. But the one that's mainly different is openness. And openness is a creative trait. So openness, people who score highly in openness tend to be very innovative, open to new ideas. They tend to be, in the parlance of the startup world, be very coachable. And this certainly, I think makes sense, right? And so high in conscientiousness and high in openness. Now, what's really interesting about this is when we dig into the data, only about 3% of the human population tests highly in both conscientiousness and openness. So it's a very rare combination. And if you think about it, it has some friction between these two things. The other people that test very high in openness are artists and creative people. And, they often have a reputation for not being conscientious, right? For being late, sleeping all day, maybe indulging in substances to stimulate their creativity, etc. And so highly creative people tend not to be matched well with conscientiousness. And so it is a fairly rare trait, which I think makes the test even more useful, because when you're looking for successful startup founders, you're looking for a very small subset of people who can exhibit these two traits that, again, are fairly rare in the scheme of things, right? Okay, so I gave away a little bit of it before, but here's kind of a summary of kind of the traits that you would see in somebody who scores highly in both of these. And I think to what Osman said earlier, we're already kind of taking note of these things, and we're kind of jotting this down, but we're doing it usually in a more disorganized way. And we're just saying, oh, I like this person, they're a hustler. I really like how they were able to answer this question about their data. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, those are good points, but I think with the scoring of Ocean, you can create some more science around it and add that to your repertoire of startup evaluations, right? So, and here's my scores, just in case anybody's interested, or at least these are my scores the last time I took it. So I'm fairly high in openness and conscientiousness, but I'm not super high, right? So you would see maybe somebody that's more perfect as a founder would be in the 90th percentile or something like that. What you do see is that founders do tend to be a little bit less agreeable, but not always. So that can be a trait you look for, but it's not necessarily great. There's a video, and maybe we can put it in the show notes, of Mark Andreessen talking to Andrew Huberman about what he looks for in founders. And he does mention the openness and the conscientiousness, but he also mentions that they tend to be low in agreeableness. And I think he's more looking for the sole operators and the hardcore Elon Musk type that tend to, ruffle people's feathers and stuff like that. And he has some good rationale behind it. But when you look at the macro data, and there's a bunch of studies involving tens of thousands of entrepreneurs, agreeableness tends to be fairly balanced. So some people are less agreeable, some people are more agreeable. People do not tend to score very low or very high. And I think you can imagine, like, people who are very disagreeable probably are going to have trouble attracting good coworkers who actually want to work with them. They might have trouble attracting investors who don't like to deal with them either. And so I think, it's certainly good to question and to, not be afraid to push. But at the same time, generally speaking, when you're building a business, you do need help. And I think being super disagreeable can be as much of a negative as a positive. And then founders do tend to be lower in neuroticism. And I think that makes sense, right? It's very stressful. It's very scary. And, if you only have a month and a half of runway until your company's going to expire and you just freak out and have anxiety, you can't leave the house, that's probably not a good fit for being a founder, because that sort of situation happens all the time. So I think you do tend to need to test low in neuroticism. And neuroticism is essentially a negative trait. So yeah, it's like a larger reaction to negative circumstances, right? So anxiety and depression and things like that. So they do tend to score low. But the one that is by far, the two that are the most consistent is the scoring highly in openness and conscientiousness.
I'm curious to know, in terms of the test, what is that? If you could share, maybe I'll put it in the show notes as well, the link for that particular test.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll send two links. I have a free one, and maybe that's a good place for people to start, but it's not quite as comprehensive. So there's also a paid one, it's $10. But there's actually subcategories. So underneath agreeableness, for instance, there's two subtraits that it tests for as well. So you get a little bit more of a deeper dive into the specifics of that. And so for instance, in extroversion, I'm a mix of extroversion and introversion, and the subcategories dig into that a little bit more. So some parts of that I test highly in, and some parts I don't test highly in, but it averages out to a total score right in the middle. So I think that's really interesting, and it's worth $10, but I understand if people maybe want to do a test run on the free one. So I'll definitely be happy to provide that. Good question.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, for me, the typical pushback I get around these types of things, like I'm an INFP or an INTJ or something like that, this is a different type of framework. And some would say, you shouldn't rely too much on these types of tests because it's kind of fickle, it doesn't have any science based. My personal view is it's a framework, and a framework is better than nothing. And just in general, I mean, what type of reactions have you had to these types of frameworks from the network of people that you mingle with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say an analogy to me is a lot of the financial modeling we do, right? So I went to business school, we did tons of financial modeling. It's almost never correct, but you need a way to distill the huge amount of data that exists in the world into something that's manageable for humans to operate with, right? And so I think financial modeling and spreadsheets and templates are one way to do that with math and financials, and that's great. I think this is a version of that for the qualitative aspects, and I think to your point, it's one tool in the toolbox. It's not, we don't only have one hammer in the toolbox. When we go build a house, we have all sorts of different tools, and I think this is the same thing. You have your financial analysis, you have your market analysis, you have all these different things. This is just another way to that in there. With regards to the reception, I think people are just really engaged with it because there doesn't seem to be much out there on evaluating the qualitative and personality aspects of founders. I was actually really surprised that more had not been done on this topic, because so many smart people have spent so much time on all of the other stuff, measuring, all the factors we just spoke about. But when you're in the early stage, the people are the most important piece, because the business might look nothing like it does today, but hopefully the people will still be there. And so are these the right people to be running a startup business or not, might be one of the most important questions you can ask and find the correct answer to. And so I think this could be a really effective tool to integrate into your own toolbox for evaluations on potential investments as well.
I think something that jumped out to me as well, and we had this conversation after demo day, and you were talking to me and Ali, and we were just off the cuff just discussing how different we were in personalities. And this is something which I typically look out for when I'm talking to founders, and me and Razi, when we've done interviews, we've been able to glean insights, in the background from the way the two founders might interact with each other while they're on the call with us. And what I'm personally looking for is how well do they complement each other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be in complete agreement with each other, but how do they interact, and do they get on? Do they fill the gap in terms of what somebody else has got as a blind spot with another? And the framework in terms of, do we need everybody who's conscientious and agreeable, or do we need a combination of somebody who's got that combination of conscientiousness and agreeableness, and somebody who's got a lot more openness and is willing to have a look at a new idea and to be able to experiment. And we were just laughing because if I look at my co-founder Ali, he's definitely has some stronger traits that I don't have, and you just made that comment about one being more open and one not, and just in terms of being willing to experiment. How are most of the founders that we've seen come through Accelerating Asia are not single founders, they're usually combinations, usually 2 or 3 founders together. How do you apply this type of framework? Can you apply it to the whole team, or do you need to look at the individuals and then come to some kind of framework to see how they fit together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Maybe let me start with something from the beginning of what you said and then circle back to that specific question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think, something, because you talked about noticing or like traits or behaviors that you notice that helps you kind of get to that conclusion that they're a good founder, right? And so one thing we noticed, and now I'm seeing a lot of corollaries with Ocean, is during the accelerator and in the application process, one of the tests we have was communication speed and communication completeness. So if you ask a founder for something, how long does it take them to get that to you? And how complete do they actually answer your question, right? And so we had data showing that the faster that they get back to you, the more likely they were to outperform as a startup founder, right? So it's like a direct correlation. And I think that's a conscientiousness test in a different way, right? The other one we noticed, because we do have the accelerated program, is the founders who had attendance at the highest percentage of our program events were the most likely to succeed. And again, I think that's a conscientiousness factor, right? So for me, if I'm late to a meeting, I get so much anxiety and I'm like pinging the person and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm gonna be late. Like I'll show up like 20 minutes ahead of time and get a seat and a coffee, because like the waste of time is much more valuable to me than being late and being like, so I think there's some sort of conscientiousness thing. I may be overreactive there, but I think that's like a bit of a test of conscientiousness, right? So anyway, those are kind of 2 points that we've noticed that I think are directly correlated into the kind of the Ocean framework or complement it. With regards to the multiple founders, it does get a bit complicated here because it depends on the role. So I would say if you have a CEO that's very powerful and the co-founder is mainly along for the ride, and so this might be like a Jobs-Wozniak type situation where I think Jobs was very much in control and Wozniak was absolutely necessary and had a lot of filled in a lot of gaps that Jobs had, but I don't think Wozniak really ever was making a lot of the decisions at the end of the day. I think Jobs was just a very controlling, and so in that situation, I think mainly you test Jobs on the Ocean test and you make sure that the team works. Obviously, you need to test that, and I actually don't know if Ocean is an effective framework for measuring the likelihood of founder conflict or co-founder conflict, I should say, right? So that's an interesting question. I'd be happy to look into the data, but that would be my point. If one person's very much in control, then they should probably exhibit both of these. And I think Steve Jobs did, although I'm sure he tested very low on agreeableness, and I suspect Elon does as well. When you have people that have power sharing, I think it might get a little bit more complicated, and perhaps you need them both to test highly in it. But it's a really great question. The data that I've seen, including a study out of Harvard, which I think looked at around 30,000 entrepreneurs, was mainly measuring the CEOs. And so the scientific data I've seen is mainly around the CEOs. And so the team dynamic is something that I haven't seen fleshed out from a data perspective, but it's a really good question.
I mean, we see in some of the larger organizations like Amazon Web Services as well, the more I've reflected on this framework, the more I see that filtering through into some of their value frameworks as well. Like they call it disagree and commit, which means like, yeah, you can be disagreeable, but you just need to get on with it. And that's like really forcing people to be more agreeable within their organization, knowing full well that they're pulling in a huge pool of resources, and most of the time the larger you get, the slower things become because too many people are debating and discussing. I would probably say that this is the biggest impact for inertia in organizations as they become a lot larger, because everybody then suddenly wants to avoid conflict, but then nobody wants to make a decision. I actually had this opinion when I was working in my old roles, and I always used to jump on a call with maybe 15 people. Everybody had an opinion, but nobody had the authority to do anything. And so you would literally make the sarcastic comments of, okay, well, who's going to make an operational decision on whatever we're discussing? And you'd hear nothing on the end of that call. So you'd have to say, who's got, pull out your job cards and tell me who's got the word operations in their job title and tell me. And it often meant that some of us had to force ourselves to become more disagreeable to kind of get decisions made. And in the startup world, the teams are a lot smaller. And I'm just curious how these personality traits change as the team starts to scale up. So when you go from pre-seed and pre-series A to Series A to Series B. I mean, and I'm just going to finish off the thought that, you know, I've talked to my co-founder and we've both said that when we get to a particular size, we're both going to have to step back and bring in a professional, like a professional CEO and a professional chief operations officer, because we're kind of gifted amateurs and we know that, and we're good at certain things and we're not good at other things. And I'm not sure, do we have enough data points to be able to talk about when you should start to hand over to different personality types for a startup as it begins to scale?
It's a wonderful question. Okay, there's a few interesting things you've hit on here that I think are worth maybe pulling out separately again. One is the difference between large organizations and small organizations. And it's a little bit of a sidebar, but I think, you know, one thing I say to my startups is, as a small organization with limited resources, you really only have two advantages over the larger companies that have economies of scale and inertia. And inertia is actually really powerful when you have lots of resources, although there are obvious negatives, right? So number one is speed, and that, I guess, relates to your inertia, which can be good and can be bad. Usually it's short-term good and long-term bad, right? So in the short term, the thing just plows through problems and just keeps going, and there's cash generation, and that's just plow through the little guys or whatever. In the long term, it can be bad because you don't innovate, you don't change enough, and then, you know, all of a sudden you miss something, right? So I think that's the speed aspect, and startups obviously can move much faster because you just have a couple people making decisions or whatever the number is. And then secondly, which is again a little bit off topic, but you have the ability to talk to your customers every single day, and large companies cannot do this, right? And that helps you to move faster. So these are like feedback loops. So you should be talking to, depending upon your business, and like 10 to 20 customers per week. What's working, what's not working, what features do you want? What are we doing well? What are you doing wrong? You know, find out who your 5-star customer is and who is your 1-star customer and why are they 1-star and 5 stars, and get more 5-star, you know, customers and fire your 1-star customers. Anyway, so that's kind of a sidebar, but I think something important for startups to focus on. With regards to agreeableness within the organization, and when you switch over, what I wonder is, and I don't know the answer to this, but I suspect the higher you go in the organization, the more disagreeable people you want. Because at the bottom of the pyramid, like, you kind of just want the people to like follow the rules. It's just like an assembly line. You're a bit robotic. I mean, I don't want to, you know, but I know a lot of large organizations, like the bottom of the pyramid role, they just want to make it so that like any human can just do it, basically, right? As long as you show up on time. Like, and then as you go up the organization, I suspect you're open to more disagreeableness because you don't want to lose the creativity and the IQ. And I guess, you know, in theory, the IQ would be going up as well as you go up the pyramid, right? And we didn't talk about IQ. Yeah, that's an important aspect of success in life and in business. So, and then I wonder is if you're at the very top of the organization, is that going to be people in theory that are more disagreeable, because again, you want to have that constructive criticism. And when you reference Jeff Bezos's, you know, dictum about disagree and move on, I think he was trying to have his cake and eat it too. Like, I think he wanted to have creative, disagreeable people, so the ideas were voiced and they didn't miss good opportunities for innovation. But I also think he knew that would, if you just let that go without any rules, it just creates chaos. And so it's like, okay, how do I get the awesome ideas, but also don't let it turn into chaos and anarchy? And to me, that's maybe what that was trying to do. I don't know the answer, but I think he may have been trying to have his cake and eat it too. I suspect if you're a CEO, you would like to have very agreeable board members who just let you do whatever you want. And I think we might find that that's the case. With regards to your situation with like, maybe you want to hire a professional, I really have no answer there. I think I've seen companies do it at very different levels. I think LinkedIn is probably one of the most famous examples. I think fairly early, the founder stepped away and you know, hired a replacement as CEO and stayed on as chairman. And I think he just decided he didn't have fun anymore. It wasn't, you know, a lot of people like the 0 to 1, but then when it turns into a big thing, it's like, this isn't fun anymore. Let me just get out for my personal reasons. So I think that's probably part of it. With regards to what's best for the organization, I don't know. That's a great question. I suspect there's lots of variables to consider, but I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, all of this has triggered like a whole bunch of questions in my own mind as to like how start to progress further on. My next question really is around the latest cohort that we've just done. Did all of the founders go through the framework, and how did they rate?
Yeah, we're implementing it now. So this is actually a fairly recent thing. I've been working on that for about a year now, but I wanted to do, more research before I implemented it. So we implemented it, but we didn't make them take the test, but we implemented into our evaluation kind of in a light way. And when we went through the process internally, we learned about the framework as a team, and the IC was looking at, and kind of doing it on our own. The next cohort and going forwards, we're going to be implementing the test officially and making all the founders that make selection week, which is typically about 30 startups, will be taking the test. And so going forwards, it will. I think what you'll find is that what I also want to do is back test. So I want to give out the test to all of our portfolio companies and see how the alignment goes with track record now that we have 5 years of data on that. And I think that will be really interesting too. So we'll be rolling that out as well. And then who knows, long term, it would be great to have more data around this. And so maybe that's a project we'll work on, going forwards outside of, not just with Accelerating Asia, but in a larger ecosystem way. But yeah, it's still fairly early days. So we're looking forwards to rolling it out, implementing it, iterating, learning more. And certainly if anybody has any data or ideas, I would love to hear from anybody in the audience who wants to get involved or has anything to add on the topic.
I think backtesting might be interesting, but maybe who knows, once founders know that this is an important, being open and conscientious is an important trait they were looking for, then maybe they might try and score high. But of course, there are other things that Accelerating Asia looks at beyond just this score to decide who to take in for that particular cohort. So I guess this is one part, but not the end all and be all of selection.
I think it's an interesting point. Yeah, you could maybe cheat a little bit, but when you go through the whole process, it's basically just a different, larger, less, not that we're less organized, but we're less scientifically organized around the ocean framework. But we do so much behavior testing, and we put them in front of so many different people for evaluation that are all looking for these cues, that I think it would be a big red flag if they tested really high in O and C on the ocean test, but everyone was like, what the hell's wrong with these founders? Like, they're missing all the meetings and they don't have any information, that would be like, there's obviously something weird going on here, right? Yeah.
I'm also wondering, to add to Osman's earlier question about when do you bring in a professional to take over the reins, right? So wondering, when a founder starts off, or when co-founders start off, they're very open, they're very conscientious. But then as the journey goes by, maybe they become increasingly neurotic. They get worn down of life.
In theory, and I'll send you guys a different ocean video about just ocean generally, and it's a longer one, but it goes into, you're born this way. In theory, your test should not change depending upon your circumstances. So what'll happen is, yes, certainly you can have higher anxiety or lower anxiety days, weeks, and months, depending upon your life circumstances, but your tested neuroticism should not be higher or lower. So I test really low in neuroticism, and there's actually bad things about that. So there's times where I probably should be scared and I don't get scared, right? So that could be bad. If I'm in front of a lion, I'm like, hey buddy, and I should be running away, as an extreme example. So, and then other people are higher neuroticism, and there's a reason for neuroticism. It's built into us for a reason, to keep us safe. And so, but startups are just not neuroticism friendly, shall we say. But yeah, in theory, the test should be fairly static from year to year, unlike some of the other tests that we see out there. Yeah. Now, age changes us a bit, so we do see that, and there's data around, the changes in our political beliefs also change with age, and some of this also turns into the ocean results, but it's fairly slow. You wouldn't see this over 1 year or a quarter. It would be a decade before you really started to notice major changes and that sort of thing. So in theory, it's fairly static, and therefore, and that's one of the reasons I think it's useful and should be fairly reliable, is because you're not going to get this depending upon the day, or if you can pay your bills, you're going to have a different score, right?
I mean, it just reminds me the meme where you've got the dog in the burning room. What we're basically saying is we need more of them as startup founders. I'm in danger. It's fine.
I think you're right. Yeah, everything's fine. Yeah, I think that's perfect. I think that's perfect. Exactly. And he's high in openness and conscientiousness, and everything's fine. I think that's exactly what it is. I think we'll have to make a customized meme on that one, Osman. I think that's perfect. We can tell the investors in our evaluation selection week that this is what we're looking for.
Are there any things that we haven't asked that we should ask, Craig?
I don't think so. I mean, conceptually, it's not super challenging. Again, I would just reiterate that not only do I think it's useful for investing in startups, but I think it's useful for any human to understand themselves better. And understanding yourself better can help you slot yourself into situations where you're more likely to enjoy what you're doing and be successful. And that's actually one of the prime determinants of success in life, is people who like to do things tend to work harder at them and enjoy them, and that's why they're more successful. It's not necessarily because you're smarter or other types of things. It's, I really like doing this, and so I'm happy to work at it, 12 hours a day. And then people are like, oh, why is that person successful? And it's mainly just because they like doing it, so they work hard. And so what's your version of that, right? And the other categories we talked about. But I think that's why finding the right people to run a startup is so important, because are they the right people to want to work 12, 14 hours a day and have all this crazy stuff happening and not freak out about it because they're low in neuroticism, and be open-minded and creative and innovative at the same time? Like, this is the super combo we're looking for when we're trying to invest in founders that are most likely to be successful. And the other people probably shouldn't be doing startups. That's not their fit. They should be doing something else. And the sooner they find that out, the better for them too. It sucks to fail, but when you fail at something you shouldn't be doing, you probably should just fail earlier and move on to what you should be doing, right?
Yeah.
Anyway,
all right,
I wish
cool.
I wish I had known that earlier. I would say, personally, like, I wish I'd been better at, like, there's a lot of things I tried to force myself to succeed at. I was like, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to succeed. And I was like hating life and hating myself, and I wasn't successful. And I'm like, I'm so unlucky. I'm like, no, I was in the wrong job, or, I was just in the wrong situation. And if I'd understood myself better, I think I could have avoided more of those, and I could have quit more of those more quickly and gotten myself into the fit sooner. And that would have been better for me. And so I think this is good for investing. It's good for just people generally. And I think it's a great concept to spread around, and hopefully adds value to people.
Thanks, Craig, for running us through this ocean psychological framework. And for everyone who's watching, it's great for evaluating business success potential, but also great for making sure that you are pursuing the right career even, and how you place in the world. So please do take the test. We'll leave it in the description below. And as always, if you like this episode, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in a future episode.